Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled Air Inter Flight 148 Accident, January 20th, 1992. Now, this is in an ongoing series shortly after the Airbus 320 came out, and of course, Airbus had claimed that the aircraft was uncrashable and monkeys could fly it and stuff like that. And they very quickly were made aware that maybe their airplane wasn't so crash proof as they had thought. And this is another hole in the protections, if you will. Actually, it's more of a hole in the flight management system, and I'll kind of talk about that because I've got an interesting relationship with the development and the options on the mode control panel. Now, this flight was a scheduled flight between Lyon and Strasbourg, and it's attributed as a controlled flight into terrain accident, and they did not have a GPWS system on this, and I'll get into that for an amazingly horrid reason why they didn't have it. But in this accident, there were 96 people on board, 90 passengers, 6 crew. There were 87 fatalities, but there were actually 9 survivors, which is pretty amazing, the fact that this was a pretty high rate of descent into the terrain. Now, as I have mentioned, the Airbus aircraft is a good aircraft. I enjoyed it. I instructed on it, but you have to respect it, you have to understand it, and you have to be properly trained, and you can't have an attitude that this aircraft is going to protect you. And Airbus promoted that, and that's a big error to promote that. Now here we are coming in Strasbourg, and Strasbourg is in a hilly region. This is the JEPS chart on the actual airport. Now, they were landing on runway 5, and there is no ILS to runway 5 because of the high terrain, which you can see in this depiction here. So what they would typically do was they'd come in on an ILS to runway 23, and they would circle around and land on 5. Well, because of departing traffic, that wasn't going to work. So since you don't have an ILS to runway 5, they were going to vector them to the VOR DME for runway 5 and come in and land. And this is one of these typical dive and drive type of approaches where you select vertical speed for the approach. We've got this little button here where you can select vertical speed or flight path angle. And you can select one or the other. Now, at the time, the standard Airbus configuration was simply a 2-digit display, and they selected a 3.3 descent angle, and inadvertently they selected 3,300 feet per minute. Well, the only difference between the display indicating that you were doing a 3.3 flight path angle, that's the FPA there, or you were doing 3,300 feet, was a little LCD period between the 3 and the 3 in this case. So if you didn't see that little period, you could mistake what mode you were in. Well, I was chairman of the ALPA National New Aircraft Certification Committee, and I was on our airliner's introduction of the Airbus onto our fleet. And we were looking at a lot of aspects of this aircraft and things that we liked, didn't like, were concerned about. And there was one option on how you wanted flight path angle or descent rate to be displayed. And we said we do not like the fact that it's only a period between the two. So the way it worked for us was that if you were descending at, for example, a 3-degree glide path, it would just be 3.0. If you were descending at 3,000 feet per minute, you got all 4 digits. So you were doing 3000. So you should notice the difference between the two. And if that would have been the situation here, they would have avoided this accident. Now, another interesting thing on this whole accident is that they did not have a ground proximity warning system. And is speculated that they did not have this system because they were facing very serious competition between France's high-speed trains, and the Air Inter was encouraging their pilots to fly low and fast. Now, you have the 250 knot speed limit below 10,000 feet. Well, they didn't want them to fly that. They want them to. They typically flew this course at about 400 miles per hour, well above the speed. And it's kind of interesting. When I was involved in some of the early flight tests, I was deadheading on some of the French airliners' flights. And one time I was going into Paris on an A300, and I'm talking to the flight engineer there, and I noticed that we are going about close to 300 knots there. It was well above 250. So I leaned over and commented to him, I guess you guys don't have that 250 below 10 here, do you? And he kind of laughed and said, well, the captain's in a hurry to get home. So they did have it, but apparently it wasn't terribly enforced. But when Air Inter was flying high speed at low altitudes, they would get nuisance, as they called them, ground proximity warning alerts. And so what do you do when you have a problem like that? Well, you take the system off the aircraft so you don't get the alerts. That would have, of course, alerted them to the error. Now, the aircraft crashed into the mountain 10 and a half miles from the airport at an elevation of 2,620 feet. And they launched a fairly extensive search and rescue operation. They had 3 helicopters, 24 motorcycles, 950 people from the police department, as well as 24 radio amateurs. And I find the radio amateurs interesting because I am one, KC0ZN, and they participated in the search. However, they did not find the crash site until 4 hours and 15 minutes later. And they were actually led to the crash site by one of the surviving passengers. So here again we have a situation where Airbus is brought to the realization that their aircraft can indeed be crashed. You can't fly it with monkeys, and it is not an uncrashable airplane. And one of the things that came out of this accident was realizing that the depiction on the mode control panel, although as an engineer you can sit there and look at it and go, yeah, that period, you should see that. But in the heat of the battle, things like this don't work. So now if you put 3,300 feet per minute as a rate of descent, it shows up as 3300. If you put a 3.3 degree glide path in, it shows up as 3.3. And of course, you just need GPWS on commercial aircraft. That has saved so many lives. There's just no way to get around it. And one thing that we did, being involved with the early on designs of these aircraft, we weren't able to influence Airbus very much early on. We had a lot more impact on Boeing and McDonnell Douglas at the time, and that may seem strange the way things are going now, but they actually very much appreciated our input because airline pilots fly aircraft differently than test pilots do. In fact, even airline pilots who are test pilots fly aircraft differently than test pilots. So we brought a lot, and I'll explain that in some future videos about some of the things, some of the enhancements we brought, and they were well appreciated by the companies at the time. And of course, there's been a lot of cultural changes over the years, decades. Anyway, I hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching.